Cemeteries. Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple. And tonight I am very glad to welcome back Loren Rhoads for a celebration of her book, 222 Cemeteries to See Before You Die. Let's give a hand for Loren. Loren is joined tonight by Josh Wilson. Let's give a hand for Josh as well. Thank you. I'm really glad it's the season of cemeteries, but I think the season of cemeteries is kind of all year round, but it's when the majority of us are perhaps thinking about them. So I'm glad to be able to do this in October, really fitting with the season. And I'm also really glad that we have a few extra cemeteries joining us from the 199 Cemeteries edition that came out a couple years ago. We're really glad to have you back. And I don't know, I'll have to do a side-by-side comparison to see what is an addition, or you'll talk about it.
I'll talk a little bit.
You'll talk about it. Okay, great. So thank you for joining us here tonight, and also in person and also online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving to the camera. We have some fun cemetery nerds joining us online. I know that for a fact. And online people, I think we have some cemetery nerds in person as well. I think it's safe to assume that. Anyway, thank you for joining us. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We open each of our events with the land acknowledgement, which I think is particularly pertinent for Loren's book as well. We are operating on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land, and we think that land acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We at Green Apple in particular would direct you to the Ramaytush Ohlone Land Trust. We have details about that organization at the back desk with a QR code that will take you directly to them if you are interested in how to participate in this project of rematriation. Very brief business before I let these two take over. Now's a good time to silence your phones if you have not already. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event you are currently attending. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, do ask me and I will gladly help you. We have copies of Loren's book at the front register. You can find them there. If you have been here before, you have certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. And I will say, too, now that it's about that time, the holidays are coming up, and this is an excellent gift. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Josh Wilson is an editor and journalist in San Francisco and the publisher of The Fabulous, Words and Art. You can find them online at fabulousmagazine.com. He is also a clawhammer banjo student and an avid bicyclist on the streets, slopes, and trails of the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. How fabulous. I'm so sorry. But to make up for it, let's give one more hand for Josh Wilson. And last but most certainly not least, Loren Rhoads is the author of Wish You Were Here, Adventures in Cemetery Travel, and editor of Death's Garden Revisited, Personal Relationships with Cemeteries, as well as Morbid Curiosity, Cures the Blues. She has served as a cemetery consultant for, what a cool thing, a cemetery consultant for AAA, Travel and Leisure, Atlas Obscura, Horror Writers Association, the Chicago Tribune, and other publications. Her well-trafficked blog, Cemetery Travel, details her first-hand visits. She lives here in San Francisco, where there are no active cemeteries. Her book, 222 Cemeteries to See Before You Die, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Loren Rhoads.
I think I'm going to start the evening by reading just a little bit from the introduction, if that's okay. This is called Stopping to Smell the Roses. When you stop to notice, you realize people are buried everywhere. Every tourist destination has a cemetery, from New York City to Hong Kong to the Isle of Iona. Some tourist destinations are tombs, the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the Taj Mahal, or the royal mounds of Gamla Uppsala in Sweden. There are permanent residents in museums, houses of worship, ghost towns, battlegrounds, even in national parks. You may have already visited someone's grave without giving it a second thought if you've been to Pompeii or Westminster Abbey or the USS Arizona Memorial at Pearl Harbor. Why would anyone go out of the way to visit a cemetery intentionally? In addition to the fascinating stories they contain, cemeteries can be open-air sculpture parks full of one-of-a-kind artwork. They provide habitats for birds and wildlife, as well as arboretums and gardens of surprising beauty. Cemeteries appeal to art lovers, amateur sociologists, bird watchers, master gardeners, historians, hikers, genealogists, picnickers, and anyone who just wants to stop and smell the roses. Our relationships with the places we visit can be deepened and enriched by learning the stories of those who came and stayed before us. While 222 cemeteries may seem like a lot, that number really just scratches the surface of the possibilities of cemetery travel. I wanted to spotlight beautiful places because I think we sometimes overlook beauty in our rush through our day-to-day lives. I also wanted to focus on historical sites, especially places where history has changed in the telling over the years. I wanted to look at familiar stories and to remember lesser-known people, knowing as I did that any list of grave sites is idiosyncratic and reflects the collector's fascinations and eccentricities. What sets this edition apart from the original 199 cemeteries is, of course, the addition of 23 cemeteries. These include states missing from the original book, along with some other American favorites. Like the first book, this edition skews toward the United States, since the update was suggested to me by an American publisher, and I've done most of my traveling here. I filled in countries that were underserved in the first book and added burial grounds like Milan's amazing monumental cemetery that I shouldn't have left out the first time around. I hope you'll be as fascinated by these gems as I am. Let's see, we'll skip a little bit here. I tried to include as wide a range of locations and cultures as possible, while being reminded that permanent grave markers are a luxury not everyone can afford, and not every culture chooses to create permanent memorials to their forebears. Sometimes I couldn't find enough information about a site to write an entry. Other times the graveyards were too fragile for visitors. This book is by no means the final word on funeral customs, because humans are so various in their traditions. Hopefully your curiosity will be sparked, and you'll use this book as a jumping-off place to learn more. Rule number 1 about visiting cemeteries is to be respectful. Don't interrupt or impede mourners. Even cemeteries that are closed to new burials deserve to be treated like something precious and irreplaceable, because they are. Just as you would when visiting a pristine wilderness, take nothing but photographs. If you find a grave marker that's broken, or in danger of breaking, let the grounds crew or office staff know. Leave everything where you find it so the next visitor can enjoy it as much as you have. Whether you take a tour or follow a guidebook or simply wander on your own, be aware of your surroundings. Most graveyards are safer than city streets, but if you feel unsafe, listen to your intuition. I've never had any problems on my cemetery travels, but I have seen a rattlesnake skin shed in the grass and roamed alone to some pretty isolated spots. Stay alert. There's nothing like visiting a cemetery to give you a little perspective, to remind you that every day above ground is a good day. I hope you find some inspiration for your travels here. Yay. So that's my manifesto.
As I'm listening to that and looking at the book and preparing for this, I checked out your Wikipedia page, and you're kind of a stealth productivity machine. You crank it out. You're an author and editor of a half dozen nonfiction books, five novels, a bunch of chapbooks, and at least 3 dozen short stories. One of which I have to plug is coming up on Friday at the Fabulous, called Protection Spell. It's our little Halloween trick and treat. And it's a charmer.
Oh, thank you.
Very pleased to run that. You were the publisher of Morbid Curiosity magazine. Mm-hmm. And I would hear that name mentioned when I was a volunteer and a listener to at KUSF FM back in the wild 1990s. And what the heck is Morbid Curiosity magazine? What's that all about? And I also was this cultural affect that you have going on in the city also extended into the music world with your husband Mason, who was a real pathbreaker for the incredible music of the Tokyo and Japanese underground of the time. And I think that kind of turned out to sort of boomerang around your cemetery writing, because you went to Japan and...
Yeah, the first time we went to Japan, we stayed with some nice musicians who were friends of Mason's. And they'd seen my first book of cemetery essays, which was Death's Garden. And they really thought we should see old Japan and a cemetery. So they took us to Kamakura, and it was amazing. It was such an education. You know, and to have the liberty to have people who live in a country take you. It's pretty much everywhere we've traveled. We've run into people who've been really gracious and said, "Oh, you're into cemeteries. I know this place." But in Japan especially, that was really a treat. We wouldn't have ever found things on our own.
Looking at the Japan segment of the book, two of the entries really kind of captured for me the scope of the book. The first one was Okunoan, am I saying that correctly? Okunoan, an ancient cemetery and where the remains of the founder of Japanese Buddhism remains.
Yeah.
And also the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. And I wonder if you want to reflect on sort of the scope of history and
Well, Okunoan is, it's interesting because it's the largest cemetery in Japan. Cemeteries in Japan tend to be very small. They're temple grounds. And the Japanese traditionally don't have full body burial. They have cremations and just urn burial. So they're very compact, and you can fit a lot of graves into a space. So this graveyard is enormous. It's kind of fit into a forest. And there are graves of like a rocket ship, you know, monuments that are very unusual for Japan, a coffee cup. And there's a pest control company that has a cenotaph to all the bugs that they've killed, because this is a Buddhist site. So I haven't actually been to that one yet. That's one of the places that's on my list.
the bucket list.
The bucket list, yes. 222 bucket list. Hiroshima was a place we went that first trip to Japan. And we went on our own, just the two of us. They make it very easy for Westerners to travel there. But it was interesting, as we talked to Japanese, a lot of them had been on school trips. That's what they did. That was their high school trip, was to go to the Peace Park. And they wouldn't say much except this is a very sad place. And I kind of appreciated that restraint, because it didn't color our experience of it, which was just intense. I didn't realize it was a grave as well as the museum, but there's a tumulus mound where they buried all the ashes they could find of people who died that survived the bombing and then died of their radiation poisoning. And one of the moments that really struck me is we were looking at the museum, and it was intense. It was very carefully worded so that it didn't demonize America, which I thought was incredible. You know, our country had been bombed. It would not have been so sensitively handled. But they made a point of talking about how it was a race, all the other countries were developing similar weapons. And even at that, I was just, you read about shadows photographed on walls and things like that. To actually see it was intense. So I was trying to find a quiet place, someplace where I could sit for a minute and kind of absorb what we were seeing. And, there were all these little school kids in baseball caps, and I didn't want them to have to deal with this crying American woman. They had enough going on. They didn't need that too. So I finally found a corner, and I was trying to pull myself together, and I looked up, and Mason is absolutely surrounded by 8-year-olds, and they all wanted to shake the American's hand. And I just thought that was, it was an incredible moment. So.
The description of that site is pretty devastating.
Yeah.
And because you provide a little timeline of what happened and describe the site, and there's a picture of the shell of the central clock tower, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I compare that to the Okunoan, which apparently there's lamps there that have been burning uninterrupted for, legend says, for 1,000 years at least.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really telling as going through your book, it becomes apparent we're dealing with way more than just travel and tourism. This book is bringing together history and archaeology and design, our relationship with nature and landscapes and myths and legends, religion, culture, class, big time, and politics with the internment place for the martyrs from the Chinese Communist Revolution. And it's really the entire scope of the human experience that we find in these plots, these terrains. I wonder if there's anything you want to share.
I don't know.
That.
You just summed it up beautifully. What can I add to that? That was one of my goals, I guess, with this book. I tell the story that I wrote a lot of it with Shut Up and Write. I don't know if you're familiar with them. Yeah, they're terrific. It's a group of people who get together in a cafe and you open your laptop or notebook or whatever and you write silently together with all these people. So I had been writing with this group for a couple of months. I didn't know anything about them other than their names and what they were working on, because that's all you talk about. You just sit down, you introduce yourself, you say, I'm going to commit to doing this today. And so I didn't really know these people other than briefly. And the day after the 2016 election, we all sat down together and passed a box of tissues around. And some people were writing letters to the editor or, journal entries or, trying to make sense of things. But I was working on 199 cemeteries at the time. And we were all so angry and surprised, caught off guard. I realized I had to channel everything into this book, that I wanted to be as many cultures as I could possibly include, as many religious practices as I could include, and make everything the same length and the same weight so that you're not, it's not skewing Christian, it's not skewing Jewish, it's not skewing Muslim, it's everything in the world. All of us all have to deal with death eventually. And the way cultures have done it varies over a scope of time. One of the things we talked about was gravestone iconography. Mm-hmm. And when the Puritans came to Massachusetts, they didn't believe in iconography on tombstones. So they would get a field stone, and that was all you got. And then a little bit later on, you'd get a field stone with your initials, or a field stone with your initials and the date, which then eventually developed into the memento mori stones you see with the winged skulls and the gritted teeth and all of that. And those originally were really cartoonish, but they got to be more and more anatomically correct as things changed. It was okay to have iconography if it was a warning. And then as Christianity changed, people decided that you didn't actually spend eternity in the ground waiting to be called. You might go to purgatory or hang out someplace and then go to heaven. And so then iconography changed so that there's winged cherubs on tombstones. And I think that's fascinating, that all of these religions have changed subtly over time, or had massive schisms over time, and it affected how people are buried and what their graves are marked with.
And it really, you had described to me a progression, which you framed up there, and it kind of demonstrates the fluidity of religious belief, and there's always talk about the fundamentals, but actually it changes according to what we need from our religion. And just to quickly hit on that topic of the headstones and the monuments, there was a progression you described: graven images, cherubs, and soul effigies.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I guess the Puritans did not permit graven images.
Mm-hmm.
But then they did move on to the cherubs, and then there's the soul effigy. And what is
lovely?
A soul effigy?
Well, the original soul effigies were just kind of happy winged faces. They're not angels, although they look kind of angelic. They look cherubic, but they're, it's to symbolize the soul as happy and free and, not trapped in the coffin forever. But you see more of that as the, now I'm going to blank on the name, the Wordsworth and the Transcendentalists.
Mm-hmm.
You see a bunch of images of like souls. I'm thinking particularly of Laurel Hill Cemetery. There's a grave monument where Death is this beautiful woman in a gown kind of sliding off her shoulder, and she's opening the sarcophagus, and a tongue of smoke is coming out, and in the smoke is a face. And it's just to symbolize that death actually releases the soul. You're not trapped in the coffin. You're going up, and that was a huge change from, believing medieval Christians believed you had to have every single bone. You had to be buried whole, because when the trumpet sounded, you needed to gather all your bits and stand up. And if you couldn't find a bit, then you went to heaven and you were missing something. I just find that fascinating. What a strange thing to believe. So yeah, it's changed every time.
We had discussed this experience of the cemetery beyond a historical site or an archaeological site or a place of stories as this little point where the borders are thinner.
Mm-hmm.
And we go there for a variety of emotional experiences around being close to not only other people's passages but our own as well. But I wanted to...
Sorry if I got you out of order now.
That's okay. I have lots of notes. I wanted to actually hit, if we could, on a few historical notes. This book is full of them. You mentioned Père Lachaise and Highgate Cemetery, the Taj Mahal, the Great Pyramids of Egypt, and the AIDS Memorial Grove, which is frankly freshly turned soil in this town. And there's a wild one I saw in England called Sutton Hoo.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
An Anglo-Saxon barrow.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Sutton Hoo is fascinating to me because the property was owned by a woman, and she wanted to excavate it, and there was a lot of drama with she was not professional. Little Miss couldn't dirty her hands and mess in the grave and all of that, and so she hired an archaeologist and snuck out there and dug on her own property, and they discovered all kinds of things, and the traditional archaeologists couldn't believe that all of her things must have been planted. She couldn't have possibly found the things that she found. But it dates to the Anglo-Saxons.
8th century?
Yeah,
like
before the Normans came from France in 1066, so early. And it's up on a hill overlooking a river with these big mounded burials. And the mounded burials I find really fascinating because they're all over the world. People have buried. Here we have the native shell mounds. But on the East Coast, we have like serpent mounds or something like that. Across cultures and across the world, The tumulus in Hiroshima is the same sort of deal. The Vikings built these huge mounds over their dead, and most of them have been plowed under at some point. The farmers have just plowed them down. So it's rare to find one that's still in shape, but there are still a number of them that haven't even been opened yet, and I find that really fascinating.
You had said that the entire idea of the cemetery is a fairly modern idea.
Well, having a cemetery with everybody, everybody being everybody who can afford it, but everybody buried with a monument that's permanent is fairly new. It dates more or less to Père Lachaise in Paris. Before that, people were buried in churchyards, and the example I use is the end of Amadeus, where they dump his body in a mass grave. That wasn't unusual. It wasn't because he was poor. That's just the way people were buried. And people didn't get monuments or markers or any sort of memorial unless they had vast amounts of money and they donated it to the church. They were buried in the church. Churchyards sort of spun out of that in villages and small towns, but in the city, you were buried in a mass grave. There weren't markers. Père Lachaise changed that. That was the first time that people were buried as families together in one place. Before, if you died, let's say grandma died, she's buried under this tree, and then the children, if they died, they're buried on that side of the graveyard. And people were all over. Your family was all in the same churchyard, but they weren't buried side by side. And so Père Lachaise was an opportunity for bourgeoisie to buy a tomb and be buried together for generations. And that was really unusual. And in this country, it pretty much dates to Mount Auburn in Massachusetts, which is just a glorious place, so beautiful. But it was designed by the Horticultural Society in Massachusetts. So it's a built landscape with planted trees and ponds and streams and curving paths, all kinds of stuff, to encourage people to come and enjoy it. In a churchyard, you didn't spend time. You cross the churchyard to go to church, cross the churchyard to leave, but you didn't loiter in the graveyard. In Mount Auburn and Père Lachaise, you were meant to come and enjoy the park-like peace and quiet, and think lofty thoughts, read poetry in court, and have picnics, all kinds of stuff. But,
So it continues to change. Anecdote, I'm a Grateful Dead fan, and on the course of going to a Grateful Dead function of some sort, live show down on the peninsula, somebody says, let's go to Pigpen's grave. Lon McKernan, it was his band. He was the R&B guy, and died young of cirrhosis from his whiskey habit. And he is at Alta Mesa Memorial Park, and I thought that's pretty cool. Let's check it out. We found the marker, and it had harmonicas on it, and empty whiskey flasks, and what struck me about the entire place is that there were no headstones. It's all inset plaques, and so anonymous. It kind of freaked me out and was a little kind of offensive in a way. Just maybe that's my East Coast mentality.
no, that's how I feel.
So what's the story with no headstones?
It kind of, I should scratch that, start again. It dates to Forest Lawn down in LA. Hubert Eaton bought the graveyard when it was a graveyard like any other. It had headstones and monuments. Frank Baum was buried there that wrote The Wizard of Oz. A very normal looking graveyard. And he kind of traveled around, and he was trying to figure out, he'd failed at a bunch of different careers, but this was the thing he was going to make a success. So he traveled around Europe, and he looked at graveyards, and where I see beautiful art that's one of a kind and amazing and effective and all of that, he found it very gruesome and depressing. And he thought cemeteries were really depressing. So the way to get cemeteries to be less depressing is erase death, right? So if you're a Protestant of the right stripe, then the grave it's just a receptacle for the clay, right? Your bodies are, or your soul's already gone to heaven, or wherever it's ended up, but you've already been judged, you've already gone on your way. So the graveyard is just a holder, and he reduced gravestones to these plaques, so that when you go to Forest Lawn, what you see is this huge 300-acre meadow with trees and crazy American kitsch artwork, but you don't see the dead people. And there are sculptures. People can buy sculptures and use them as grave markers, but you never see nothing that would make you sad. It's like happy family scenes and lovers or whatever, but it's very, I think of it as forced cheerfulness.
That erasure.
Yeah, sorry, I have a little issue. I have a little attitude about it.
But that erasure of death, as you described it, is very American and very Californian in particular. I mean, isn't there a tech guy who wants to beat death and
live forever?
Live forever.
Yeah.
He's got out.
Yeah.
If they're going to eventually freeze his head, if he can't find the longevity serum, he's got to
upload to the computer.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
What is it? Kurzweil? Is that the guy? Ray Kurzweil?
Is that right?
Somebody wants to. They want to immanentize the singularity, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in after that. So.
Well, here we are in San Francisco, and there aren't any cemeteries in San Francisco, but there are a lot of bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about where we find them and why there aren't any, and any headstones, and the phenomenon of it. Like, how did it happen?
Well, San Francisco started as a very small town, right? It started with the Presidio and the Mission. And the Mission graveyard, the Mission graveyard was quite large. It was under 16th Street. It was under Church Street. All of that area was graveyard at one point. And clearly that wasn't going to be enough graveyard for everybody. So they built a graveyard down at Civic Center. It wasn't Civic Center then, it was the edge of town. But that graveyard was going to last for decades. It was going to be so big, and they filled it in 10 years. And because San Francisco kept growing, right? People kept coming out, and so then they started this enormous cemetery complex out where the Target is now, off of Geary. Spanned from there to Laurel Hill, over to where St. Ignatius is, USF. All of that was graveyards, 4 big graveyards. And that, again, was going to last forever. So much burial space. They were going to bury people there for hundreds of years. They also had a city graveyard out at Lincoln Park where the Legion of Honor Museum was, or is. And in 1899, the city decided that really the city needed more space to expand, and the cemeteries were in their way, so they were going to forbid any more burials in San Francisco, which is what leads us to Colma and all the graveyards down there. Which, if you haven't been, I totally encourage you to go to Colma and poke around. But it was decades of going back and forth. If you've looked at the ballot for San Francisco now, there are things that keep coming up every cycle. We've already voted on this, we've already settled it, but the city didn't like that answer, so now you get to vote on it again. And it was the same sort of thing with removing the graveyards, decades of back and forth in court cases. But eventually, all the dead were evicted, and most of them were moved out at Lincoln Park. Less so. Headstones were moved, bodies were not. And so when they dug the new underground display space at the Legion of Honor Museum, they turned up hundreds of bodies. And they had just built the museum over it, on top of it. And, we talked a little bit about the little girl who was found in 2018. Somebody was digging in their backyard and there was a coffin. And some of that is that the records were lost in '06 when the City Hall burned. And some of that was just people not being careful. Or the dunes had shifted, and people who had been 6 feet deep were now 20 feet deep. So there's a lot of reasons for it. But, it's just hard to wrap your head around because San Francisco is such a new city. When you think of London and Rome and places that are actually old, we're only 200 years.
200 and some odd, yeah. But there is that matter of it is again a very American thing, this idea of memory versus progress, and I think you use the term manifest destiny, sort of.
Yeah. I think that's a term I got from Beth Weingarter, but San Francisco was going to keep growing, and people had already started building out. The Cliff House was in place long before there were houses in between. But San Francisco was going to reach the ocean. It was going to grow. So the dead people had to get out of the way.
We're coming up on Q&A, but we have a few more moments. I just want to throw a few more moments?
Yeah.
Throw a quick one at you. How did this all start? Like, when were you first like Cemeteries?
Oh my God. Okay. It was totally by accident. We were meant to be going to Barcelona. Mason, my husband, is a musician, and so he was going to do sound for Survival Research Lab's show in Barcelona, and they didn't have any budget, so we paid for our own ticket. We were just going to get to Spain and spend time there, and as we were trying to leave San Francisco, the first Gulf War was ramping up, and so we kept missing connections, and they kept rerouting us, and eventually they sent us to London, where we didn't have any plans to go, and we were supposed to get a flight from there to Spain, and we missed that one, and we just decided, okay, let's stay in a country where we speak the language. It was our first time traveling abroad. We had no idea what we were doing. Let's just take a breath. It was the days before cell phones, right? So we couldn't call them and say, hey, where are you guys? Because they got chased out of their first, I think the first 3 sites that they were going to do the show at, because the army kept mobilizing and taking over their places. So we had to call a payphone in Spain and hope somebody who spoke English answered it and could connect us with them. So anyway, we stayed in London, and I found this book, photos in Victoria Station that was called Victorian Valhalla, about Highgate. And it was just the most glorious collection of photographs I'd ever seen. And he talked about the cemetery had been abandoned in the 70s and was falling to ruin. And Friends of the Cemetery bought it in 1975. And they were the first Friends of the Cemetery group that had formed. They were not affiliated with the cemetery. They wanted to rescue it so it didn't fall totally to ruin. So the guy in the book said, this romantic dissolution you see in the book, it's not going to last. They're going to fix it up. You better go see it now before they fix it all up. So we went. It was a January day. It was freezing cold. And nobody in the cemetery but us and the caretaker, who was like, oh, Karl Marx, he's over there if you want to see, sure, Karl Marx, we'll go see his grave too, but that wasn't what we were there for. And every time you turned around, there would be an angel, and she'd be like overgrown with ivy and nothing but her face and one hand or something like that visible. And it was the most amazing place I'd ever seen. And somebody had already, one of our friends who'd gone to school in Paris had said we needed to go to Père Lachaise, so that was the second half of our trip. And after that, it was like, wow, every place has a graveyard. We're going to see what they look like, because it was out of hand.
I'm actually surprised. I thought it would have been like you were, 12 or something.
No.
Wednesday Adams or something.
No, one of the guys I dated in high school wanted to take prom pictures in the cemetery because we were all dressed up in our finery, right? We were going to go stand on the mausoleum steps. And I thought, sure, why not? But I didn't see that as like my life path or anything.
Actually, in high school, we had the local cemetery up the road from high school. There was a spot we would all meet to do teenage stuff, and Oliver we called it. That was the family name. It was a big above ground mausoleum, Oliver, and you go meet at Oliver at a certain time. And I think are we at Q&A time here?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Anybody got any questions for Loren?
You better ask questions because I'll ask you questions.
Can you talk a little bit about the columbarium and
Here in San Francisco?
Yeah. Do you have any plans on where you would like to go when your time comes? Not to be too morbid about it, but we are to talk about it.
We have to say, I think for the YouTube audience, the question was about the columbarium in San Francisco and where.
Yeah, where I want to end up.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind ending up in the columbarium. The columbarium is this amazing Edwardian structure. It's the last piece of the cemeteries that's still in place in San Francisco. So it's over, it's behind the Kinko's. I don't remember what else is over there. It used to be a Pier 1 for the longest time, but it's not
Parker
anymore.
or something?
Yeah, it's Turk and...
It's a little spur off of Turk.
Yeah.
It's right across
Lorraine
from Rossi Playground.
That's
yeah,
it.
if
Yeah.
you go right around
Yeah.
Rossi, it's right there.
An amazing place. Tiffany windows and inlaid marble floors and just incredible stuff. And the best thing about it is it's a repository for cremains, but people aren't limited in what their urns they use. So people have their remains in cookie jars or paint cans or coffee cans or just all these really interesting different containers, and everyone can decorate their niche however they like. So they're false eyes and extra teeth and toys and just all kinds of incredible stuff inside the mausoleum. And I'm doing an event there on Saturday night. Thank you. Sunday night. Doors at 7, open at 7:30. We're going to talk about the Death's Garden book, which is another cemetery project that I put together. So that should be fun. And where do I want to end up? I would really like to end up in the columbarium, but I haven't scraped the pennies together. I'd really like to stay in San Francisco.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
We have a question from our online audience. Beth Weingartner asks,
Excellent.
are there any cemeteries where your ancestors are buried that you would love to visit but haven't yet? And where are they, if so?
Repeat that.
Beth asked if I have cemeteries where my ancestors are that I haven't visited yet. And not on my side of the family, but Mason's side of the family, his father's family is from Arkansas and in Catawba Gap, which is, as far as I know, just a little fold in the mountains. We haven't been, but they have a graveyard where the Jones family goes back for generations. And we've donated some money for the upkeep and stuff like that, but we've never been. They do the family reunion in August, and I'm never going to set foot in Arkansas in August. I'd like to go and visit them someday. Drive the kid along,
Any other online audience questions?
We should let me pimp Beth's book too. It's called San Francisco's Forgotten Cemeteries. And it is a history of a very extensively researched history of how the cemeteries were moved from all the different places, Telegraph Hill and North Beach, and it's a great book. So yeah, check that out.
We do actually have another online question.
Okay.
This is from Wednesday, who says, When you were in Japan,
Mhm.
did you see the wind phone that allows the bereaved to have one-way conversations with their loved ones? I understand there are more wind phones in other countries now too. Do you consider them to be related to cemeteries?
The question is about wind phones. They originated in Japan, where it's a place where there's a phone booth in a cemetery where you can pick the phone up and speak, and there may not be somebody on the other end, but the intention is that you can speak to your loved ones, send a message to your loved ones. And it's started to pop up in all kinds of different places and in different permutations too. And I think that's a really cool idea. That one of my issues, I have many issues, I guess, but one of them in particular is that during the AIDS epidemic, one of my friends died, and at the time, everybody was testing positive, and we really felt like, no one was going to be left to mourn. So what's the point of having a grave? Because who would come? So we scattered his ashes, a little here, a little there. Some of my friends ate some got them tattooed into their skin. But he didn't have a grave. And it was really strange to me not to have a place to go and talk, because my family's all buried in a little country graveyard in Michigan. And, I always go and talk to them. I don't necessarily believe that they're there waiting for me, but it feels good to me to have a place where I can go and remember them. But Blair didn't have a grave. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to include the AIDS Grove in our book is that I felt like it was really important to acknowledge that it's not a cemetery per se, because nobody's officially buried there, but there are urns buried there. People scatter ashes there. It is a sacred space in the sense that a cemetery is a sacred space. So, yeah, I love the idea of wind phones and being able to commune however you're comfortable.
I was struck by the inclusion of the AIDS Grove, and as you were speaking, saw a parallel with that in Hiroshima as a memorial for great wrongs done against populations. Mm-hmm. If you consider the inaction of our government in the 1980s and a certain first lady, and a lot of those names wouldn't even have to have been written on those stones, and it's terribly tragic.
Well, going to see the quilt in the park a couple of years ago was the same experience for me. I mean, it's basically a mobile cemetery, right? You just roll the quilt out and there's monuments to all these names that would not be remembered. They would have all vanished into history. And of all the plagues, you can see diphtheria in the cemetery. You can see the Spanish flu. You don't see AIDS, because people didn't put that on their headstones, for one thing. But a lot of people, like my friend, didn't have monuments, weren't buried, because in some places, the undertakers wouldn't deal with their bodies, wouldn't touch them. Medical people wouldn't touch them. And so they were cremated and they're gone. And the power of seeing this quilt, even the fraction that was here in San Francisco, is seeing monuments to all those people that would have been lost.
Yeah, the idea of memory and communion. And actually, as you were speaking, I also thought about the Civil War and the spiritualism movement we discussed, and maybe you can just sort of hit that one.
During the early years of the Civil War, when so many people were dying far from home, they went off to war and they didn't come back. And initially, like every other war in history, people were buried on the battleground. They were just left. And the army moved on, and nobody knew where they were buried. It wasn't important. They were collateral damage. So for the people left back home, spiritualism was very popular, that there was a way to reach your loved ones. Your loved ones weren't gone, they weren't out of reach, they were just basically in the next room, and you could communicate with them. And we were talking about the cemetery up in Sacramento, the Old City Cemetery, where you can see on some of the headstones where people are talking about they didn't die, they went to the Summerland, which is the spiritualist heaven. And I think that's really beautiful. But it sort of fell out of fashion with World War One. You know, at that point, the scale of the devastation was so great that between World War One and the flu epidemic, people stopped trying to communicate to the dead and started to focus more on living, and that leads us into the parlor at home where you lay out the body. You know, got co-opted by the funeral parlor where they lay the body out someplace else, and you don't have the dead people in your home. And yeah, it's a whole thing, which I find really fascinating.
And the ritual, just to quickly hit on the rituals of spiritualism, the seance, the medium, the would a Ouija board be
Yeah,
a
same
factor
thing.
of that?
Yeah.
We've got about 5 minutes,
Take one more question.
something like that. Any other questions?
Hi. I'm curious if in your research you found there's the Hollywood Forever Cemetery that does movies, but maybe there are other cemeteries that also have these other uses that aren't necessarily just.
I love that.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Okay.
I love that question. Yeah, your question is, Hollywood Forever is known for showing movies on the mausoleum. Are there other cemeteries that do similar events? And yes, and more and more. And Colma actually was showing movies on the cemeteries, on the mausoleum this year. I don't know if it was the Italian cemetery, it was one of the ones that are closer to the BART station. But they showed, I think it was Nightmare Before Christmas, which would be really cool to see in a cemetery. But there are a bunch of cemeteries. Cemeteries have kind of hit another turning point. There are all these new technologies coming out with recimation and body composting and green burial and all of that. So a traditional cemetery needs to either adapt or they'll go out of business, I guess is the short way to put that. So a lot of cemeteries have decided, originally with Mount Auburn and the garden cemeteries, they were cultural hubs. People went there and they read poetry and they spent a lot of time in the cemetery, not necessarily just grieving. And so modern cemeteries are doing the same thing. Cypress Lawn down in Colma does trolley tours. They have a little trolley, and you can, the tours are all different themes. Some of them are wine themed or suffragette themed or, historical figures or whatever. A number of cemeteries have book clubs, which I think is really fascinating, where you read a book about somebody who's buried in the cemetery and then go visit their grave or something like that. Some cemeteries, I'm thinking of the Congressional Cemetery in DC, do races. It's not either, I can't remember if it's Run for Your Life or something like that. But anyways, through the cemetery, it's a fundraiser. And, all kinds of different things. Greenwood in Brooklyn does these enormous musical nights where they open the mausoleums and they set up musicians inside. And Chapel of the Chimes does that over in Oakland, where it's on the solstice. It's, what would you say, like 30, 40 different musicians in every nook and cranny as you walk through the mausoleum. All kinds of really creative, interesting stuff. So there's a lot of places like that. You're welcome.
And the book is full of little anecdotes like that. Every place seems to have its own own weight and seriousness. You know, it's not as if any one is more impressive than the other.
No, thank you.
You had said that the cemetery really is a mirror to our society, and I, especially when you're describing how we engage with it in a more celebratory way, it's striking. I was also struck that, you know, in Sutton Hoo there was a horse interred, and there's a horse cemetery in Kentucky that, what, 1,000, 2,000 years later,
Yeah.
they're still doing that.
Yeah.
And Alexander the
And a
Great's
horse is a big thing to bury, right? You know, that's a lot. That's a big hole. Yeah.
a fascinating mirror and into our world and our lives. Are there any other questions from the cyber world or here that we're missing?
I believe we have one more, and then
All right.
that can close us out.
Okay.
We're right at 8 o'clock now, so.
Okay.
So you guys are off the hook, because normally I'll go around the room and like ask everybody what cemeteries they visited.
Loren, how do you feel about, excuse me, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Stolperstein? Some people say they're disrespectful, and others say that they're powerful memorials. Have you seen them?
Oh, I don't know anything about that.
How do you spell it?
Stolpersteine.
No, I'm sorry.
You can consult the Oracle device.
My
I'm looking it up.
German
Here we
or
go.
whatever is not good, so.
Stumbling stones, small concrete cubes with brass plates that commemorate victims of Nazi persecution and extermination.
Oh, I have many thoughts about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
They're cobblestones that are set into Berlin, particularly. I think other places too, where rather than being kind of a level cobblestone, they'll be raised one every so often. So you trip over it, and you're forced to reckon with people who were shot down in that street. Or I think that's a really powerful way to commemorate. You know, as you walk around Paris in particular, you know, there are plaques on the walls that say 21 Jews were shot against this wall or something like that. But it's really easy to ignore that. It's really easy to just overlook it. But the fact that you have to contend with these stones that are there specifically to trip you, I think really it's a powerful statement. Dangerous. I don't know about that. I'm a little shaky on my feet as it is. Yeah, I think that's a cool idea. But I didn't recognize the official name. Thank you.
Certainly a lot of opportunity to explore ways to make memory relevant.
Well, and the
Today
thing about
now.
this is going to be my life's work, because there's so much I don't know, you know, and I'm always learning new stuff. So, yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I'm really glad you guys were here to explore my fascinations. I guess that's the way I want to put it.
You can get your copy up front at the cash register, or can you order online?
Sure, certainly.
Through Green Apple?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, web audience, hint. Loren, thank you so much. Oh, and come see Loren do a reading at Lit Crawl on Saturday at 5 p.m. The fabulous Lit Crawl is going to be at Shotwell's at 20th and Shotwell. And
Brand new story. It's going to be in the magazine Friday. And then I'm going to read it
Protection
Saturday night.
Spell.
Yeah.
It's a charmer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Loren.
Thank you, Green Apple, for having us.
Hey. Oh, you're not done yet. Can we give one more hand for Loren Rhoads? Thank you so much. I've been so looking forward to this,
Thank you.
I learned something new every time, so I appreciate it so much. Josh, thank you for being such a attentive moderator. I appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions. I am just here to repeat what Josh said a moment ago. Books are available at the front register. You can find them there. We have other books available as well. You can take a look at those too if you'd like. And we're open until 9. Make yourselves comfortable. If you would like, I'm assuming you would be happy to sign copies.
Oh, I'd love to. Sure.
Excellent.
Yeah.
If you would like to have Loren sign a copy of the book, feel free to ask her. she will be right here. If you have any other questions, do let me know. And if not, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much. A little bit. Thank you.
That was awesome. Hopefully I rolled with the.
Went really fast. I'm sorry. I told you I was gonna ramble.
No, that was good. I think I managed to get everything in there. So.
Oh, good.
I mean, this.
Between two people. An hour between two people goes by very quickly.
Yeah.
As opposed to half an hour.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to remember what we talked about the other day because I didn't take notes.
I took notes and I tried to carry that all over. Some of them didn't quite work as the prompts that they did in the cafe. And I kind of sort of had to awkwardly mention them and hope that they bridged.
We couldn't tell.
Good. Can I see a signature?
Hey.
Oh, of course.
Hello.
Fine.
Again.
I have many.
So recently with Steve down at your